Minister, I welcome the opportunity to speak here this morning on this very important motion. And indeed, the issue that we raise here in terms of vaccine passports and also the restrictions are of concern to many, many people in this state. And that's the very reason that it's been brought here, because people are very distressed and feel that there is overpowering and heavy-handed restrictions that don't warrant the degree to which they're being exercised. So I want to thank, firstly to start, I want to thank Brian O'Donnell and Deputy McNamara and indeed David, a staff member in my own office, for their hard work in regard to this motion. The motion deals with the most fundamental and constitutional legal principles and the protections that they embody. It seeks to restore those principles to the level of political primacy that they deserve in order to be taken seriously in a democratic society worthy of the name. Indeed, my colleagues and I are tired of the lip service paid to those principles within this House and within this government. We have argued right from the outset of this pandemic that the measures taken had to be proportionate and reasonable, and a lot of the time we saw hysterical reactions. They had to be reasonable and they had to be grounded in the evidence. That is why the motion we are dealing with here today is consistent and indeed cautious. It calls on government not to abandon all restrictions, but merely to allow hospitality businesses across this state to carry on their trade and to allow attendance at sporting and religious events, subject only to non-discriminatory limitations as are necessary and proportionate in the interests of public safety. By no stretch of the imagination can the system proposed by government be seen as non-discriminatory or proportionate. It is irredeemably discriminatory in the most negative sense. It is also coercive and controlling, and I believe there will be legal challenges that will follow should this legislation go ahead. In fact, it is not just bad law, it is controlled and a twisted version of what good law should be. My colleague Deputy McGrath has called it medical apartheid, and I agree entirely with that description. What else is apartheid but a system of segregation based on conditions or grounds outside of a person's control? A system where the overwhelming right and might of the state is utilised to apply pressure, both direct and indirect, on the population to achieve a specific aim of government. This is certainly true for those with particular health conditions who may not be able to take the vaccine, and people have their own private reasons for that. They have a condition outside of their control, and yet this government seeks to disregard that factor and penalise them by restricting their access. Even if government seeks to create an exemption for such people, that would still require the forcible and non-voluntary disclosure of information to private businesses. Either of those scenarios is entirely unacceptable. The very word apartheid literally means separateness or apartness. What else is the proposed system of vaccine passes before us but a system that embeds apartness into the hearts of families and communities? We will not allow ourselves to be characterised as reckless or irresponsible, and we will vigorously defend ourselves against any person in this House or outside this House who claims that we are being reckless or irresponsible in bringing forward this motion. That is why it was absolutely shameful and outrageous for the Taoiseach to suggest to our leader, Deputy Mattie McGrath, recently that if government had adopted the kind of approach we are advocating, then more people would have died. That is not true. This kind of absurd counterfactual rhetoric speaks volumes about the paternalistic approach that this government has chosen to follow, and the forceful approach, the heartless and cruel measures that have been put in place. It is a vicious attempt to shut down the kind of conversation that we urgently need to have around proportionality of the measures being proposed by government. Yes, in the beginning, everyone was terrified, and we reluctantly adopted and endorsed draconian legislation. We used that word a lot, draconian, but it is important to reflect on that word, to not allow it roll off our lips as if it were no longer a matter of great consequence. We cannot and should not become familiar with draconian laws as if they were now par for the course and politically acceptable. In such a world, the abnormal becomes normal and people don't question. That is how the road to an oppressive state power is created, and that's something myself or my colleagues will never agree with. People fought long and hard in this country for freedom, and we certainly won't have that sacrificed or jeopardised in any way. The measures proposed by government, as in the vaccine passport, are overstepping a mark. They're going way too far. In that sense, and in the specific instance, the ends most certainly do not justify the means when it comes to minimalising the spread of COVID. This is why the sunset clauses were necessary. But it is also the case that sunset clauses can create a kind of get-out clause when it comes to easing our political conscience. We need to fundamentally re-examine the nature of the laws that this government continue to say are necessary. It goes much deeper than mere parliamentary scrutiny. We need to ask why opposing such laws or seeking their amendments is now seen as tantamount to wishing death on the vulnerable. This is a dangerous situation, and we must resist the issue being framed in that way, unfairly framed and interpreted in that manner, and that's done to suit a government agenda. The laws and the vaccine pass system that is proposed cannot be made benign or harmless within the context of a massive programme of vaccine rollouts. But we know that we are dealing with a government paralysed by extreme caution and devoid of leadership, completely devoid of strong leadership, and an attitude of differential subservience to health experts who, even within the European context, are now outliers. But for those of us who are bringing forward this motion, this debate is an attempt to take a principled stance against the so-called abundance of caution that we will have shrivelled up the social, cultural and economic life of this state for almost 2 years. Those who have challenged the restrictions on religious practice through the court system, like Declan Ganley, have been strung along for months with no end in sight and no resolution as to whether or not the laws have infringed basic religious liberties, and it's our belief that they have done so. This is also entirely unacceptable. What does it say about the priority accorded to such issues, which our own courts essentially create the perception that they are deflecting the issue, hoping that it will simply go away? I ask colleagues of all parties and none to seriously reflect on the aims of this motion and to give back to the people the rights that are properly theirs without recourse to discriminatory measures. It is now time to allow our country and our people to try again and not to oppress them. People in this country were oppressed for hundreds of years, and now we have our own people here in government trying to replicate that and oppress and suppress and not listen to any views and take away the basic rights and freedom of people and invade their privacy. And that's what's happening. We hear much about data protection laws, but now we have a situation where a rural pub in Ireland must ask somebody literally part of their health history. That is nobody's business but people's own individual business. And you've stepped way too far over the line this time, and you have encroached on people's freedom and on their privacy and on their rights. Gur magat.